Hi, this is Politics by Jake, PB&J. I am Jake. I am your political reporter and commentarist, and I consider myself to be a student of history, even a philosopher of history, if you will. And I think that history is as important for people to learn as quantum physics or rocket science. And the reason I say this is because if we don't know where we've been, and you may have heard people say this before, this old saying, if you don't know where you've been, you won't know where you're going. And I have found that this is the case. There are many things that are extant in the United States today, politically, governmentally, that were also in existence many, many years ago. And when I say many years, I'm talking about 100 years, for example, in the case of fascism. We're going to get into that in a minute. So that's some of the things we're going to be talking about in this show. We're going to be talking about several things, but this is some of them, so let's get going. Now, Politics by Jake is against fascism and against Donald Trump. And with regard to Donald Trump, his influence is the greatest threat of all the threats that face this nation. Certainly the greatest domestic threat. And it is the greatest threat to the United States right now. And that's one of the things that, if you listen to me, I'll be talking about during the show. As you might expect, it's an election year, and guess what? Donald Trump is running, and he just got the nomination for the Republican Party. But of all the threats to the United States of America, like I say, the greatest of these is the rise of fascism and the pendency of Donald Trump as the de facto leader of this movement. It is the position of Politics by Jake, and I am Politics by Jake, I am Jake, that we must save our country from fascism, that this is an existential threat to the United States. We must save it from the hate that it engenders. We must save it from the division that it engenders. And if this seems strident, if this seems fanatical, it may seem fanatical. I don't think it's fanatical, but it's because I feel it is. I feel that many other people feel the same way, and that's one of the purposes of this show. Another purpose of this show is to educate, because in order to exercise the sacred franchise of democracy, which is the vote, the electorate must be educated. And one of the things that I have observed is that if you ask a person, they really can't tell you, for example, what fascism is. They can't give you a definition of it. And now, by the way, I don't expect or anticipate that it is desirable, although actually it would be pretty good, or is desirable for someone, or the man on the street, to be able to give the original 1922 Giovanni Gentile definition of fascism. But there has to be an understanding of what it is and what you're dealing with. The education of the electorate is crucial. One of the things that gives me pause is to consider that for the people who were not born in the United States and are not United States citizens as a consequence of their birth, I wonder if they could pass the test for people who want to become citizens of the United States, but who are not citizens of the United States and who need to be naturalized. And in order to do that, of course, you need to pass a test. And I question whether citizens who hold the sacred franchise, and yes, this is the sacred franchise of democracy. This is where the power percolates most plainly down into the hands of the people, which is the vote. I wonder if they really know what they're voting for. I myself will give the example that when I was 21 years old, and I'm dating myself here, but when I was 21 years old, I was able to vote in the election, and I voted for Richard Nixon. And I'll tell you the reason why I voted for him. I voted for him because he seemed like a fine guy. And the reason why he seemed like a fine guy is because I had watched a show that was very popular at the time. and the show was Rowan and Martin's Laugh-In. And he was on the show, and he did a little thing on the show. I think he went on there and he did a 5 or 10 second thing where he said, "Sock it to me," which was a well-known and famous statement of the show. And it was very funny, and it was very hip, and it was very now, and it was very groovy. And so they would record people saying this, and Richard Nixon came on when he was a candidate, and he said this. And I voted for him for that reason. And I also, because and the thing I'm trying to explain here is not to go on about myself, but I'm leading to a point here. So I voted for him for that, and I also voted for him because I'm from New York. And the governor of New York at that time was Nelson Rockefeller. And he was, I think you would call him a liberal Republican. And he was definitely a member of the Rockefeller family, and we're not going to go into the whole thing with the Rockefeller family, although that is a segment that I can do on the show at a later time, but we're not going to go into that now. But he was a liberal Republican. He seemed like a swell fellow, if you'll allow me to use a statement like that, which is an incredibly naive and superficial statement, and also because he had a wife. And his wife was named Happy. And I thought to myself, this is a fine thing. This is just absolutely a fine thing. And so that was the strength on which I voted in my first election in, I think it was 1972. And I'm telling you, this is crazy. It's crazy to use your sacred franchise. And of course, I was young, and so perhaps I can be excused. But I had been in classes in high school. I had been in government classes. And not only do I not think that in the government class I was in, and I don't think that there are government classes in high schools anymore. But in the time when I was in high school, there were, and the teacher was great, and I really liked him, and I felt like I learned a lot. But all that I learned was only sufficient and up to the task of having me vote for people on these superficial grounds, and may I say further, a member of the infamous Rockefeller family to boot. And so this is my point. We need to do a better job of educating the populace, and that's one of the things that Politics by Jake is going to do. And you'll hear me talk a lot of the things. You'll hear me talk about Putin. You'll hear me talk about Xi. You'll hear me talk about globalization, for example. You'll hear me talk about the Republican Party. We're going to talk about the Republican Party and its caucuses and what these things mean. We're going to talk about Joe Biden, and I'm going to get some things in here about him. We're going to talk about polling, and we're going to talk about a bunch of things. But getting back to what I was saying, there are people out there who call themselves conservatives. I question whether one of them, and I'm sure some of them have educated themselves up to a certain standard, but I question that they could actually give me a correct definition, and I'm not going to have them toe the line here. They don't have to give me literally chapter and verse, but I question whether these people who vote for Trump could tell me what a conservative actually is. I don't think they know. I feel that I know, and I will, in a later part of the show, articulate what a conservative is. But this is the thing. If I was thoughtful, and all I could do was vote for someone who is a member of the Rockefeller family, and if you don't know anything about the Rockefeller family, you should look it up and read about it and start educating yourself. If I could only vote for someone based on the fact that they were on a TV show and said, "Sock it to me," if I could vote for somebody just because they had a wife named Happy, this is not an appropriate or wise use of the franchise of the vote. And I think that there are so many people in the United States who are in exactly this same situation that I was in my first election in 1972. So this is the point of Politics by Jake. Well, it's not the only point, but one of the big points it is to educate people out there in the listening area so that they can properly exercise the franchise. And you know, honestly, just for the sake of argument, I don't care if you vote Republican. I don't care if you vote Democrat, but just be educated in the reasons why you vote. We have freedom of speech here. And I was arguing this one day. I was arguing this recently with somebody else on social media who wanted to portray that such freedoms were absolute. And if they were not absolute, they were not freedoms. And I went back and forth and I pointed out to him. And this is another thing that we'll talk about too, because these things are really important. Because, as I said, I was actually had a modicum of political education in my youth as a high school student. And this is the best that I could do. In 1972, in my first election, when I was close enough to those days when I was educated in high school, that I should have been able to make a more intelligent choice. But this was all I could do. And this is what I see in the things that people are doing as far as voting are concerned. And as I said, for the sake of argument, I don't care whether they vote Democrat or Republican. Just understand the reasons why it is that you're doing what you're doing. All right, now, I said I don't feel bad about this. We've got a lot to talk about, as you heard when I was talking about earlier. We've got a lot to talk about, but one of the things that I said is that later on in the show, I would talk about what a conservative is. And this is something that I could expand upon, but I want to give a brief definition because, as I said, one of the things that I want to do is to educate people so that they can correctly exercise their franchise. So let's talk briefly, for the sake of me, keeping my promise here on the show, and talk about what a conservative is. And maybe I'll talk a little bit more. Maybe I'll give a couple of more definitions of things that I think are relevant given the political situation of today. So a conservative is someone who is interested in tradition. A conservative is someone who is interested in custom. A conservative is someone who is interested in precedent. There's a respect for the status quo, and the status quo is Latin. It literally means the place in which it stands or something stands. There's generally an idea that the status quo is something that you tamper with only for certain reasons. For example, the right of women to vote. That is something that was decided a long time ago. And a conservative would look at that and say, we're not going to mess with that. There has to be something extraordinary happen for us to change the concept as articulated in the Constitution, giving women the right to vote. They're not going to do that. So those are basically, and I could elaborate more, but I don't want to tell you at this time more than you ever wanted to know, although it is an interesting topic. There's no doubt about it. But that is basically a conservative. Another thing that I want to point out about conservatives is they believe in regular order. The legislative process should have a regular order to it. Bills, for example, should not be pushed through to a vote in like 20 minutes. This is a process that should take months. It should be referred to a committee for study. If hearings are needed, those hearings should be done, and there should be a careful and considered progression getting to the point of the vote and deciding whether whether the members actually want to vote on this bill and make it a law or not. This is called regular order. Conservatives believe in this. So, while we're going on this, let's just entertain a couple of other definitions here. I think you've heard of reactionaries. A political reactionary is someone who has contempt for the status quo. And as I talked about conservatives, one of the key aspects of conservatives is preserving the status quo. A reactionary does not want the status quo. They have contempt for it. They hate it. they want to react for it, and this means usually falling backwards. So, for example, using the example that I had before, that I stated before about women having the vote, a reactionary is someone who doesn't want to keep this. They want to turn back the clock to a time when women did not have the vote. Another example of this is the kerfuffle, and it's probably all too light and inappropriate to talk about this as a kerfuffle, but the situation with Roe v. Wade having been rejected as the law of the land. Roe v. Wade is a case that goes back for decades and decades and decades. It falls into the, and of course Roe v. Wade is basically a case with regard to abortion, women having the right to abortion, but there's probably a more important aspect of it that we should consider, and that is the person's right to have control over their own bodies. And this is the province and the venue under which we talk about having the right to abortion. It's the right to have control over your own body. And so Roe v. Wade was decided many years ago, decades ago. It's an old case. This falls into the category of the status quo. If a case has been around for 50 years, for example, which Roe v. Wade has, or had, up to the time when it was rejected by the Supreme Court, about whom we shall have much to say in shows that are coming up, because the situation with the Supreme Court is an intolerable situation. It's a situation where they have begun to lost, ever since Bush v. Gore, when they ordered a sovereign state to stop its election process and interfered in the election. The Supreme Court has been losing credibility for quite a while. But getting back to the reactionary, and we have an extraordinary situation today, and we'll talk about that with regard to the 14th Amendment, Section 3, and we'll talk about it with regard to the situation with presidential immunity, which is something that is coming up. But getting back to what I was saying, a reactionary has contempt for these things. A reactionary wants to go back to the time when women didn't have control over their own body. And by derivation, if you will, no one has control over their own body, because that's really a lot of what Roe v. Wade was about. Is does the state have the right to interfere in someone having control over their own body? And in this case, the casus belli, or the cause célèbre, was the issue of abortion, which is if a woman has the right to have an abortion, that by derogation extends to the more general principle that a person, any person, not just women, but any person has the right to control their own body without the interference of the state. So that's the underlayment there. The case Roe v. Wade, certainly with regard to abortion, but there's a more dominant legal principle there. But a reactionary has contempt for this. A reactionary wants to go back to a time when women couldn't have abortions, and we now have a situation where that kind of, sort of, from a federal standpoint, has occurred. It's been what's happened is it's been relegated to the states. The states now get to decide this, and you have some states that are just enacting draconian measures, not only against abortion after the fact of an embryo or a fetus being created, but to extend this to abortifacients, like the pill, like the morning after pill. So this is all very reactionary, and these people pose as conservatives. And the conservatives, because it suits them, don't really say, well, you know, this guy here, he's not a conservative, he's not one of us, he's a reactionary. They don't say that. And the talking heads on the Sunday morning shows don't say that either. And so these shows, by the way, give these people a gift, because they describe them as something that they're not. Because most of the people that appear on these shows who are Republicans, and who, once again, by derivation, people hear the word Republican and they think, oh, conservative. These are not conservatives. They're either reactionaries or in ultra reactionaries, and I can see where the show is going now. So I guess we're going to talk about that. They're either reactionaries or ultra reactionaries, or they are full blown fascists. And since we've gotten into this, I'm going to be talking about these definitions. So getting back to what I was saying, repeating for like, what is it, the fourth time now? A reactionary has contempt for the status quo. He wants to roll everything back. He wants to go back to the time when women couldn't vote. He wants to go back to a time before when you could have chattel slavery. He wants to go back to a time before the New Deal. The reactionaries, for example, they've never gotten over Franklin Delano Roosevelt, his 4 terms, how he beat them 4 times in the row. He humiliated them. He took over the Supreme Court, according to them. And ultimately, through various means and maneuvers, he got the Supreme Court to do what he wanted. This in itself is another story that we can talk about in another show. He had the Federal Reserve following what he wanted, which just drove them wild. In 1936, he had a campaign speech. I think it was the convention speech where he talked about the fact that these people hate me, the bankers hate me, and I welcome their hatred. And this is true. They did hate him because they had to do what he said. And this was changed when Truman came along, something that we'll talk about again. I know I'm throwing stuff like this out and going so fast that you're saying, hey, wait a minute, what's this? Talk about this a little more. Well, I will talk about it. But I'm just, so reactionaries basically, they have this axe to grind and they want to go back to these things. So when you hear, for example, someone getting on the stage at a rally and saying, I want to go back to a time when women couldn't vote, you know that you're dealing with a reactionary. You are not dealing with a conservative. A conservative, a true conservative, would never say that. They would never say that, okay? So let's talk about some other working definitions, okay? So as I said, I would argue that there are actually 3 steps from conservative and going on until we have an actual fascist. And you have an extreme form of fascism, and that's a Nazi. So since we're talking about these things, it's probably appropriate to talk about, what's fascism. When you have an extreme reactionary, or let's say a conservative revolution type, because I did talk about conservative revolutionaries, but I don't like that definition. I think that you have to make it, I think that conservative revolutionaries fall into the definition of reactionaries. And so let's say a conservative revolutionary is actually a reactionary or ultra-reactionary. In other words, someone who's real militant reactionary ideologue. Steve Bannon is one of these, for example. You'll listen to Steve Bannon on his show, and basically he has the attitude that he wants to strike a match and just stand back and watch it all burn. That's a real militant reactionary ideologue, and that's what he is. That's what he wants to do. That's what he's basically said. I should probably go, if I had done more show research, which is easy to do. You guys can go online and look up this stuff itself. That's a great thing about the internet. You can see Steve Bannon saying in so many words essentially these same things. He wants to tear it all down. He wants it all to be destroyed. There comes a point where those people either go into the streets themselves, or they put on a uniform, or they have a show, or pay somebody else to do it. That's another way it can happen, right? And become leaders of a fascist movement. And the difference is you can have individual fascists, but fascism in the way we have to watch out for involves a mass movement of some kind. It involves street action. It involves hooligans. Charlottesville, there's an example. There's a good example of fascism, because there you had what? You had armed gangs, you had racists, you had anti-Semitic gangs, they were anti-black, they were Ku Klux Klan, they were cross burners out there for the Confederate States of America, which at least in some parts of the country is the object of the yearning of reactionaries. The Confederate States This is another good example. The Confederate States are a reaction against the United States Constitution. The Confederate States are a reaction against the Declaration of Independence. And why? Because they said so. Alexander Stephens, the Confederate vice president, said that the founding fathers were wrong when they declared that all men were created equal. He said that the Declaration of Independence was wrong when it said that. He said, we Confederates, we know better, that all men are not created equal. Men are created radically unequal. And slavery, he said, and this, I think you can find this in the Cornerstone speech. Go online and look at the Cornerstone speech, and you can see where he says this. Slavery, he said, is the basis of our new creation. So, in other words, that's what it is to be a reactionary. But beyond that, either you're going to put on a Nazi uniform, you're going to put a Ku Klux Klan hood on and a robe, and you're going to go into the streets. And what is it that you're going to do when you go into the streets? Then you're going to graduate you're going to beat up, political opponents, like the Nazis did with the communists. In Germany, there was great upheaval, and in Rome it was this way too. You had mobs, and they were basically beating them up, but it was between the optimates and the populares, which is the Roman equivalent. And in Germany, and we can talk about that too, but I don't want to get too far off the subject, but you had, when the Republic was falling, you had tremendous civil violence in the streets, and it was these two factions. So in this case, you're going to beat up political opponents, and then you're going to graduate, aren't you? You're going to do other things. You're going to destroy editorial offices. You're going to destroy printing presses, or in this case, you're going to find out where the computer servers are, and you're going to destroy those. You're going to destroy publications that you don't like. Ultimately, you're going to clash with other groups. And once again, I'm talking about fascism here. I'm talking about the dividing line between the ultra-conservative, ultra-reactionary, and that's synonymous, basically the same thing, and fascism. And so ultimately, if you're a fascist, you're going to clash violently, physically, with other groups, like trade unions, for example. You're going to go and you're going to try to break their strike, for example. If the police come, you're going to clash with them. And you've seen that too. So that's fascism. When you hear someone talking about fascism, that's really what that is. It's militant reactionaries, and if you want, I'm not going to argue that now, you can call them, instead of militant reactionaries, you can call them conservative revolution types. You can call them superheated conservatives, but I reject this. I prefer to call them reactionaries or ultra-reactionaries. But really, like I said, they're reactionaries. When those superheated reactionaries with violence, with terrorism, with extra legal means, when you see that, that's when you know you're dealing with fascism. And this is why Charlottesville, which of course happened a while ago, but it's still important as an example, was so important because up to this time we had seen incidents like people getting beat up at Trump rallies and stuff like this. And we had various groups constituting themselves. But in Charlottesville, this is the first time I think it appeared anti-Semitic, armed, because, they had guns, they had sticks and clubs, out there with their anti-Semitic racist slogans. So that adds up to fascism, and this is why, simply to keep saying racism and white supremacy, it just doesn't fill the bill. This is not adequate. This does not capture the new thing here. The novelty of the current situation is that we do have actual fascist gangs, and they are ideological, right? I admit that there were, and I talked about this just now, there were communists in the days of the Weimar Republic, and that's in the time of Hitler. In the 1920s, the 1930s, you had these, and there were communists, and they were using violence too. But the thing that you want to understand is the ideological marriage of a certain principle and the violence. That's what it is. So in this particular case that I'm talking about, this is fascism. They're not just sort of local groups. Now let's talk some more about this, as we're going to talk some more about conservatism. I'm going to see if I can do this up right and proper for you guys. As John Kenneth Galbraith once said, quote, "The modern conservative is engaged in one of man's oldest exercises in moral philosophy. That is, the search for a superior moral justification for selfishness." And as I said, and I'm going to reiterate now, we're going to go into it some more. The people that call the people that call themselves conservatives, in most cases, they're not conservatives at all. These are instead, they're right-wing radicals, as I said. They're right-wing extremists. They can be thought of in the most traditional term as reactionaries. And there are some of them that are embracing this term. Murray Rothbard once wrote an essay saying that the people were of his ilk, so to speak, his confrere, his group, whatever, that they really ought to be calling themselves reactionaries because they're not conservatives, especially in the U.S. setting, and probably not anywhere else. In other words, these are people who have utter contempt for tradition, for custom, for precedent, for decorum of traditional types. These are right-wing extremists. This is what right-wing extremists are. They don't respect regular order, as I said. They want to create something that is not, quote unquote, the conservation of the best of the old order, gradually improved through organic change into something new and more effective, close quote, but keeping the benefits of the old. The Conservative Party, the Republican Party, is supposed to be conservative principles. I'm going to reiterate this again because we talked about, I kind of put my foot in it because I said I was going to tell you what conservatives are. That they include precedent, they include custom, they include tradition, they include a certain respect for the status quo, and not a completely utopian detest for the status quo, but for tradition. And when you hear congressmen talking about things like regular order, this is an example of the kind of things that an actual conservative believes in. But this is not what they do at all. These are people instead who want to create forms of oppression that have never before existed. And when you get into the history of this, as I have said that we will do on this show, a lot of this goes back to somebody like Carl Schmitt. Carl Schmitt, you may remember him, I don't know, maybe you don't, but take it from me, he was Hitler's lawyer, among other things. He was an activist, he was a National Socialist, he was a Nazi, certainly, and wrote any of a number of books, and he is one of the inspirations of the modern neocons, but also of the group that is now in power. And there's this interesting book about a Spanish reactionary called Donoso de Cortés, and the point of this is to tell the people of Europe back in the 1920s and the 1930s, stop imitating monarchists, because you have to realize that monarchism is passé. There are no more kings, so we have to project ourselves towards a reactionary paradise or a utopia that's in the future, not located through the restoration of monarchy, as Metternich, for example, might have seen it, or as Kaiser Wilhelm, the German Emperor William II, might have seen it, were he back on the throne. No, he says, it won't be that. It will instead be something altogether new. And if on that they're not conservatives, well, then that's the whole point. And the version, and it's my contention, by the way, here at Politics by Jake, that conservatism is collapsing. It's folding in on itself. And I could go on about this. I'll say a couple of things. The version that's collapsing is the William Buckley synthesis, and it's something that was concocted by the National Review magazine by William Buckley. Buckley was a right-wing CIA figure, of course. He was from a very wealthy family, and they synthesized something that was new. It was not the organic development of anything. It was just a new thing. It was artificially concocted at the Mount Pelerin Society in the 1940s. And it was, but what it was, and this is really true, this happened, but it was this stuff about free trade, it was about free markets, it was about the fetishism of all that, and the idea of individual liberty, individual responsibility. Like I said, this is concocted, it's not necessarily organic. Individual responsibility, limited government, opposition to the welfare state, opposition to the New Deal, obviously, but it also incorporated large elements of thinking of von Hayek and of those economics, a dash of Ayn Rand, the Russian fascist. So that synthesis, which I have said, it's disingenuous. It's not organic. It's something that was created magically. As I say, go back, look up the Mount Pelerin Society, and go back and see what they said, and you'll see it there. Um, it, it so, as I said, this synthesis has more or less completely dominated the Republican Party, and it still does in some ways in the House of Representatives. The clique around Paul Ryan, who is now gone, of course, and McCarthy, some others that we have seen, chortling over the idea that their candidate gets paid by the Kremlin, are still wedded to this older philosophy. And this is important to understand who you're dealing with. But less so now, as we saw in the recent campaigns being attenuated because of the need to cooperate with Paul Ryan and the company in Congress. But what we have heard from Trump, this is not conservatism at all. What we've heard from Trump is a doctrine of authoritarianism, strongman ideology, and it's absolutely, positively hostile to constitutional government. This is somebody, and I'm referring to Trump, I'm referring to Bannon, I'm referring to Miller, Stephen Miller, and I'm referring honestly to any of a number of these people who are of his ilk and of his brotherhood, who does not believe in the U.S. Constitution at all, who thinks the federal judiciary, for example, is a vestigial organ that ought to be done away with. And that's the one that I contend is collapsing. And it's collapsing before your eyes in the sense that you now have a majority of the U.S. population, and this is for the first time. We have at least 52%, I believe, of the United States population who believe that the federal government has a responsibility to make sure that everyone has health care. It maybe not provide health care to everybody always, but for those who need it and can't get it, there should be a foolproof system so they can get it. And that is a big step forward. And that essentially grew out of Obamacare, which is actually the Affordable Care Act. That's what it's called, but everybody calls it Obamacare. And the attack on Obamacare, and the horror and the revulsion that people feel about, to use an expression, Trump care, which is nothing, which is take 2 aspirin and go die, and a Dickensian contribute to the decrease in the general population. If I can hail back to Christmas Carol, which is what that's from. It's the thing where on Christmas Eve, before Scrooge has his visions, some men come and they ask for a donation, and Scrooge says, and I'm reading here, these 2 people come up to Mr. Scrooge and they say, "At this festive season of the year, Mr. Scrooge, it is more than usually desirable that we should make some slight provision for the poor and the destitute who suffer greatly at the present time. Many thousands are in want of common necessaries. Hundreds of thousands are in want of common comfort, sir." And Scrooge answers, he responds, and he says, "Are there no prisons?" And the 2 gentlemen say, "Plenty of prisons." And Scrooge says, "And the union workhouses, are they still in operation?" And they say back to him, "Both very busy, sir." And then Scrooge says, "Well, those who are badly off must go there. Take 2 aspirin, go off and die." And the people say to him, "Many can't go there. Many would rather die." Scrooge says, if they would rather die, they had better do it and decrease the surplus population. And that's from A Christmas Carol. That is not, or pardon me, I should rather say, that is basically the Republican response to this. So there's an ideological evolution that's going on here. We're talking about the collapse of conservatism. you have these other philosophies that attempt to fill that void. You have Bannonism, which is kind of a crockpot, or you could say crackpot. You could say that too. It's kind of a stew of disparate elements. A lot of it seems to go back to extreme reactionary thinkers who are included in fascist movements in the 20s and 30s. This deference of Bannon, for example, to Julius Cesare Ebola, who is an Italian fascist, a theoretician of what they call traditionalism, which is simply what they call, it means reactionary social ideas, reactionary ideas about the status of women, the family, the structure of society, and things like this. And that's somebody that Bannon knows. And if you listen to him, you will know that he has cited to him. And there's also this tremendous hostility to multilateral organizations that are naturally oppressive to outlaw states. In other words, if you want to have an outlaw state, you don't want to be a part of any multilateral organizations. Now, these, of course, are, radical departures. And we see this in his attitude and the attitude of his group, his ilk towards NATO, for example. He doesn't want any part of it. He wants to get out of it. And then you even have more radical versions of this. And then the crisis of these old reactionary philosophies, conservatism, definitely in crisis, definitely in crisis. This is something that Trump has contributed to, but the ideological glue that was holding the party together has been significantly weakened. And the idea that Paul Ryan, who, as I say, is gone, or someone like McCarthy, could be the leader of the Republican Party, they simply can't. And you see what has happened to them. Ryan went the way of, I don't want to say he went the way of all the earth, but to use the expression, he went to spend more time with his family. And, McCarthy similarly could not hold on to his speakership. He could barely get into the speakership. It took 15 votes for him to be able to ascend to the speaker platform. And as we all know, he didn't stay there long. So this old guard, they simply can't do it. Ryan and McCarthy, Mitch McConnell, they're looked upon with contempt by many parts of the crazed base that lauds Trump and his ilk. And that creates tremendous tensions. And you're feeling it and you're hearing it in some of the things that are being talked about. The news commentators and the reporters are saying things that indicate that there's a tremendous tension in the House, for example, also in the Senate, but in the House, for example, because of this. And this is what it is. What I'm talking about is what it is. And the people who see this administration failing tend to blame less, perhaps, the White House than they do Ryan and McConnell and McCarthy and people like that. So we've talked about Bannonism, but we've also got to mention this dark enlightenment or this neo-reactionary enlightenment. In other words, my argument is that those people today who call themselves conservatives are nothing of the kind. That's what I mean. They're reactionaries. They're right-wing extremists. Some of them embrace that. They are willing, for example, to talk about slavery. They are willing, for example, to talk about monarchy. And again, this has no American tradition in the past 150 years, has anything to do with that. And so in other words, this is not conservative. This is reactionary. And what else do we have? Other forms of ideology here. I'm just speaking kind of trippingly off the tongue, the top of my head. Other forms of ideology are there. I guess the one that we ought to talk about is the alt-right. And of course, we have talked about a bit of that with Bannon. But in addition, there is something called the alt-left. And before we talk about that, let's say a few words about populism, since we're talking about definitions. There are two kinds of populisms, and I think that this is a key to understanding a great deal of what goes on and a great deal of fakery, in my opinion, that goes on in the swindle that is the political racket, and it is a racket. You find you have cultural populism, and cultural populism can also be thought of in terms of wedge issues. In other words, divide and conquer, demagogic appeals to backward prejudices of masses, things like that, like guns, like God, like abortion, and there are so many of them. These are also known as they're wedge issues. They're also called rube bait, and it's basically the idea that the people who propound these things, who are in power, appeal to the idea of the masses that somehow their interests and theirs align, and they don't. Nothing could be further from the truth. They're conning them, they're grifting them, they're playing them. And this is the essence of cultural populism. And that, to a great degree, I wouldn't say it's the essence of Trump, because there are several elements to Donald Trump and to this movement. But this cultural populism, this wedge issues, this rube bait is one of them. But there's also an economic populism, and the economic populism tends to be left-wing. You could call it progressive if you want. It should be anyway. So in other words, you have economic populism being kind of on the left, and you have cultural populism kind of being on the right. And this difference is one of the greatest in current political affairs, because people who call themselves populists, xenophobic, anti-immigrant, right-wing reactionary types, they are economic populists. So what's with the cultural populists then? I mean, what can we say? It's demagogic. It plays on resentments. It appeals to people who feel that they've been neglected or shut out, and the remedy is that they should get to hate the people who have done this to them. The idea that there could be real remedies in the world, remedies in the actual real world, this is always rather distant. It's blurry. It's like if you inject this idea to it, it's like, hey man, you're just confusing the issue. So in other words, it's a demagogic plain. In other words, it's like, don't confuse me with the facts. So in other words, what they want it to be is a demagogic playing on resentments, status anxiety. In other words, the idea that you're being pushed aside in favor of other groups, and just rage. And the typical form of it, it's a typical Republican attack on what we might call them mush heads if we want, because quite often, honestly, that's what they are. But left-wing mush heads who indulge in Chablis and Brie and have Gucci shoes and drive hybrid cars and all this stuff. So what you get out of cultural populism is not an improvement of your situation. You really don't. Instead, you get a theatrical performance. And is that not what we see when we see Donald Trump and all his fascist, Nazi, reactionary rallies and the kinds of people who come out of them? What are we seeing? We're seeing a political performance, a theatrical performance. So you get to be the witness of a political soap opera where you've got some hero. Go on social media. Go on Twitter. See if this is not what it is. See if it's not a continual theatrical performance. So you go and you have this political soap opera where you've got some hero, and that's, Donald Trump, who's portrayed as an outsider, which is ridiculous. Nothing could be further from the truth that Donald Trump is an outsider. He got for the election in 2016, somebody calculated that he got, $2 billion? It was at least $2 billion in free publicity. And I want to tell you that no outsider gets free publicity like that. Not 2 billion in some, I've heard numbers as high as 5, but it's definitely 2. No political outsider gets that. You think that they do? A, I've got a bridge in Brooklyn that I want to talk to you about. B, I have some swampland in the Florida Everglades that I can make you a great deal on. And C, wake up. Wake up. But, one of the great things, and these are people who could talk about the concept of the lumpen proletariat again, people who've fallen out of the middle class for one reason or another, but they've successfully portrayed this and parlayed this, and this is Trump, who's done this, as an outsider with a placard around his neck that says outsider and rebel, and he's not. He's absolutely not. He's a con man, he's a grifter, and he laughs at the people who fall for his con like this. And this character, usually coming from the oligarchy, and of course it's Trump, is going to wage a protracted struggle against the elitists and the insiders. Now, of course, the latest outsider that was sold to an audience of dupes on this basis was somebody, and again, when I say the latest outsider, I'm referring to Trump, was somebody who had a sweetheart relation with the New York Federal Reserve Bank. And the New York Federal Reserve, although a lot of people will tell you this isn't true, but just take it from me, with all the Federal Reserve banks, and there are Federal Reserve banks in various parts of the country, the New York one has the most power. It has the most power. Some people would object to this. They would say, oh no, that this isn't the case. But it's always been a problem that the New York Federal Reserve Bank has had, let's say, outsized powers. Let's say that. This is someone, and I'm referring to Trump, who had very good relations with the New York headquarters of the various television networks. As I say, I grew up in New York, and we used to call him the Mouth. Everybody called him the Mouth. Everybody thought he was a joke. And he was in the media all the time because he was always talking. And that was one of the things that a lot of us looked at him and thought, this guy just does not know when to shut up. But he played to the media, and the media loved him. So therefore, if these things that I have said are the case, and they are, Trump really can't be considered an outsider. But he got the placard hanging around his neck, played the part. Once you're on stage, you start playing the part, and the audience will ooh and ah. That's what's going on. You see it at his rallies all the time. You've seen it since 2015. You're seeing it now. It's almost 10 years later, and he's doing the same thing. Now, this cultural populism, the ugliness that I'm talking about with regard to it, is that it often plays on race. It often plays on ethnicity. It often plays on localism and sectionalism and regionalism. How many Republican candidates will say, I represent, blank values? One that always struck me was this guy who came out and said, Indiana values, or the one who said, that's not how we do things in Virginia. So in other words, it's parochialism, it's localism, but not celebrated for their own sake, but mobilize in order. In other words, it's like I said before, they don't really care. People who do things like this, they're trying to convince the populace that their interests align with theirs. And this is not the case at all. They're not celebrated. They don't talk about Virginia. That's not how we do things in Virginia. Indiana values. That's not why they're doing it. They're mobilizing them, not the middle class, but I would call them lumpen proletariat, but as people who, for one reason or another, and I should really define this more, I can't do it now because I'm moving on this other thing. I don't have the time, but there are people who have fallen out of the middle class, and there are various reasons for this. And they're doing it in order to mobilize these people as a means of excluding somebody, othering them, as the French, what can we say, post-structuralists would call it this. And there is, of course, always a pledge, to defend the interests of the little people. But in fact, the real goal is often the personal aggrandizement, power, gain, money of this maverick oligarch, this maverick financier. And of course, you understand that what I'm saying this, I'm talking about Donald Trump, who breaks momentarily with the consensus of those opinion and who strikes out on this quest. Now, economic populism is the kind that we urgently need, really. It's a rational appeal to enlightened self-interest. It says, here are measures that are reasonable. They're within reach, they're feasible, and in many cases, they've already been done. Obamacare is an example of this. They've been implemented, they've fallen away, they've been abrogated, rolled back. But what it is a rational appeal to enlightened self-interest based on concrete, measurable economic reform. And it is that because it makes sense in the real world. And what do you get out of this? You don't get the momentary fascination or entertainment of some ranting orator who makes fun of the university-educated set or the pointy-headed Washington bureaucrat or whatever it is. But what you get out of this is real improvements to your life, that your child can go to college, that you have a nicer home, that you have more years of education, that your life expectancy increases. How about that? Want more life? Sound good to you? That your standard of living goes up. It becomes easier to find a job. It's easier, therefore, to assert human dignity in the workplace because you find another job. That's the choice between the two kinds of populism that we've been talking about. The cultural populism is in severe crisis as a result of these kinds of current events. That, by the way, and we'll talk about this more, believe me, you'll hear a lot from me on this. This is why the right hates Biden, because he's doing this. More on that in a moment. Now, to close, here's something that I believe that Ted Kennedy said this when he was alive. I wish he'd practice it more in his life, but he said this, if you give the people the choice between a cultural populist who puts on a show, this is what I've been talking about, puts on an entertainment act, a comedy routine, satirizing, mocking, scorning, baiting the various elitists and insiders. That's one choice. Okay? You get that. You can go that way. But if your other choice is an economic populist who is proposing to fight for actual concrete improvements in your life that translate as prosperity, not a slogan, but in the details, in wages, in the hours, the vacation time, the housing, the education, the mass transit, and so on, that all other things being equal, voters will incline towards the economic populist.